Welcome to Crime Before Modern Law. Here, we explore how crime and justice functioned before modern policing. If you find this topic interesting, feel free to leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if you would like to support the channel, a like or subscription always helps. For much of human history, courts did not try to solve crimes the way many people expect today. They did not start by collecting physical clues, testing evidence in labs, or building a case from small facts. Instead, they often aimed for one thing above all others: a clear admission of guilt. To modern ears, that sounds backward, but in many past legal systems, a confession was not just one kind of evidence. It was treated as the best evidence. In some places, it was seen as the only fully complete proof of guilt, especially for serious crimes. This episode explains why confessions mattered more than facts in many pre-modern courts. It also explains how legal rules, religion, social order, and limited investigation tools pushed judges toward confession-centered justice. First, we need to define what facts meant in older systems. Today, facts in a criminal case often include physical traces, medical findings, expert opinions, and long chains of smaller observations. A case can be built from fingerprints, DNA, phone location data, video footage, chemical tests, and detailed timelines. Many of these tools did not exist until the 1800s and 1900s. Before modern policing, most communities had no professional detectives. There were constables, watchmen, night guards, local officials or soldiers, but their jobs were usually keeping order, not running careful investigations. A crime was often handled by whoever had authority nearby: a local judge, a town council, a manor court, a church court, or a royal officer traveling on circuit. In that world, facts were harder to secure and easier to argue about. Witnesses could lie, misunderstand, or simply not know what they thought they knew. Physical traces could be overlooked, destroyed, or misread. Records were limited. Even telling time accurately could be difficult in ordinary village life. So older courts often aimed for something that seemed clearer than scattered clues, the accused person saying, in a formal way, "I did it." Why would a confession be treated as more reliable than other proof? One major reason is that many European legal systems, especially from the Middle Ages into the early modern period, followed a structured law of proof. This was tied to Roman canonical legal traditions and the inquisitorial procedure used in many continental courts. Under these systems, judges did not just weigh evidence freely, the way many modern juries do. Instead, proof was often ranked. Some types of evidence counted more than others. A common idea was that conviction for serious crimes required full proof. Full proof might mean 2 credible eyewitnesses who directly saw the crime. Or it might mean a confession. This approach sounds strict, and in one way it was. If the law says you need 2 eyewitnesses or a confession, then many cases cannot reach that level. Serious crimes often happen in secret. Murder, arson, poisoning, secret theft, and sexual crimes might have no eyewitnesses at all. So courts faced a problem. If they demanded full proof but rarely had it, they could not punish many offenders. But if they lowered the standard too much, they risked punishing innocent people based on rumor. Confession became the bridge between those two fears. A confession could turn a case that felt uncertain into a case that felt legally complete. It fit the proof rules. It produced a clear record. It also satisfied a deep moral and religious idea that guilt should be spoken aloud. That moral idea mattered. In many Christian societies, confession was a religious act. In church life, confession meant admitting sin, naming it, and seeking forgiveness. Even when a court confession was not the same as a sacramental confession, the culture still connected spoken admission with truth. To many people, a person who confessed was doing what a guilty person should do. A person who refused could look stubborn, hardened, or deceitful. This did not mean people thought confessions were always voluntary or always accurate. Many officials knew that fear and pain could push people to say what they did not do. Still, the legal culture often treated confession as the most direct route to certainty. A second major reason confessions mattered was the limited development of investigative methods. Modern investigation relies on specialized training and standardized steps, preserving a scene, recording statements carefully, checking alibis, mapping timelines, and testing physical evidence. These habits grew slowly over centuries. Pre-modern courts did use evidence. They examined wounds, looked at weapons, checked stolen goods, and listened to neighbors. But they lacked many tools for separating honest mistakes from deliberate lies. They also lacked broad state systems for finding unknown offenders. If a thief fled to another region, local officials might not find him. If a murder happened on a road, there might be no local witnesses at all. If a crime involved strangers, the community's usual way of identifying suspects, local reputation, failed. So courts leaned heavily on interrogation. Interrogation was not just asking questions. In many inquisitorial systems, it was a formal process aimed at producing a statement that fit legal proof rules. In some regions, if there was strong suspicion but not full proof, the law allowed judges to use harsh methods to obtain a confession. The logic was that the case looked likely, but the final certainty was missing. A confession would complete the proof. This is one reason torture became tied to legal proof systems. In modern thinking, torture is seen as an abuse that produces unreliable results. Many historical officials also recognized that pain could distort truth. Yet torture still appeared in legal systems because it was treated as a controlled tool for reaching a legally required form of proof. Some codes tried to limit its use. They might require indications or half-proof before torture could be used, meaning there had to be some evidence pointing toward guilt. They might also require that a confession be repeated later, without torture to count as valid. But in practice, those safeguards could fail. Local judges could be under pressure. Communities demanded results, and once torture was allowed at all, the line between permitted and misused was often thin. Even without torture, pre-modern interrogation could be intense. Imprisonment itself was harsh. Conditions were poor, food could be limited, and isolation could break people down. Repeated questioning, threats, or promises could push someone toward confession. A third reason confessions mattered was social structure. In many times and places, law was not only about proving a past event. It was about restoring order. When a serious crime happened, it created fear and conflict. Families might seek revenge. Neighbors might accuse each other. A lord, city council, or king's judge wanted to show control. A confession could calm a community because it gave a simple answer: the offender admitted it. The matter looked settled. If a court convicted someone mainly by indirect proof, the losing side might reject the result. Rumors could continue. People might claim the wrong person was punished. A confession reduced that doubt, at least on the surface. This was especially important where trials had a public role. Some punishments were carried out openly. Part of the purpose was to show that wrongdoing had been identified and corrected. A confession supported that public message. It also supported another practical need: identifying accomplices. Many legal systems treated some crimes as group threats: banditry, rebellion, organized theft, or alleged conspiracies. Authorities wanted names. Confessions often included lists of other people. Sometimes those lists grew under pressure, feeding wider waves of arrests. This pattern is visible in several kinds of historical prosecutions, including some witchcraft trials. In many early modern witch trials, legal systems required either two witnesses or a confession. But witchcraft, as defined by courts, was often believed to be secret and hidden. Eyewitness proof was rare. So confession became central. Under pressure, some accused people confessed and then named others. This created chains of accusation that could expand quickly. Even outside witchcraft, the structure was similar. When full proof was hard to obtain, confession became the key that unlocked conviction and further leads. Now compare this with parts of English common law history. England developed differently from many continental systems. Jury trials became central. The law of proof was not always as formally ranked as in Roman canonical systems, but confessions still mattered greatly. In English practice, confessions could appear in examinations before trial, including statements recorded by officials like justices of the peace. These statements were used to shape the case that reached court. Also, when trials moved quickly and the defense had fewer resources, a confession could effectively end the dispute. The court could treat it as decisive. So even where the formal doctrine differed, the practical reality often stayed similar. A confession simplified the work of the court and made the outcome easier to justify. Another reason admissions of guilt outweighed investigation is that earlier courts often distrusted circumstantial evidence. Modern courts accept that many small facts can combine into strong proof. But older systems often feared that indirect evidence could mislead. A footprint, a rumor, possession of an object, or a suspicious movement might point toward guilt, but it could also have innocent explanations. Without modern methods for testing and comparing, officials were cautious, or at least claimed to be. They preferred direct forms of proof, eyewitnesses, or the accused person's own words. This helps explain why confession could matter more than a careful reconstruction of events. The court's question was often not, what most likely happened. It was closer to, do we have the kind of proof the law recognizes as complete? When that kind of proof was missing, the court might keep pushing until it appeared. Confession-centered justice also fit older ideas about personal responsibility and moral order. Modern criminal law often focuses on what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt using external evidence. Older systems frequently treated crime as a moral stain that needed public clarity. The offender's own admission was a way of making the wrongdoing legible. It turned the crime from a confusing event into a named act with a named author. That clarity mattered for punishment. In many pre-modern systems, punishment was not only about preventing future crime, it was also about demonstrating authority, restoring peace, and expressing moral order. A confession could be framed as the offender agreeing that the punishment was deserved. That reduced the appearance of injustice. It also made punishment administratively easier. If the person confessed, fewer witnesses had to be gathered. The court could move faster. This mattered in systems where judges traveled, courts met only at certain times, and resources were limited. But this creates an important point. If confession was treated as the best proof, the system had a built-in risk. Pressure to confess could replace careful checking. When a court expects confession, other evidence can become less important. Officials may stop searching for alternative explanations. They may treat denial as proof of guilt or stubbornness. And because confession can be produced by fear, pain, exhaustion, or false hope, it can be unreliable. Many historical records show this tension. Some legal traditions tried to handle it by requiring corroboration. For example, a confession might have to include details only the true offender would know, such as the location of stolen goods or the method used. But even corroboration could fail. Interrogators could feed details to the suspect. Communities could know facts through rumor, or the accused could guess correctly. Also, in witchcraft cases, the supposed details were often about invisible acts, meetings with spirits, secret pacts, or supernatural harm. So corroboration could become impossible in the modern sense. In those cases, confession could float free from external reality. It is also important to understand the role of reputation. Before modern policing, communities often relied on what they thought they knew about a person. If someone had a reputation for violence, theft, or conflict, suspicion could fall on them quickly. If someone was socially isolated, disliked, or seen as strange, accusation became easier. Reputation was not evidence in a modern scientific sense, but it shaped which leads were pursued. Once a suspect was chosen, the process could revolve around obtaining an admission. This helps explain why investigations sometimes look less like open-ended fact-finding and more like confirmation. In many periods, the court's task was not to explore every possibility. It was to decide whether the suspect could be convicted under the accepted proof rules. Confession was the cleanest path. The importance of confession also connects to how states grew. As kingdoms and city-states expanded power, they wanted more control over crime. In some places, private accusation gave way to more official action. In inquisitorial systems, the court itself could initiate proceedings, question suspects, and gather testimony. That sounds closer to modern prosecution, but without modern safeguards, it could also increase pressure on the accused. When the state takes on the role of investigator and judge, it may treat confession as the key output of its own process. Now consider the practical environment of older criminal courts. Many courts had limited time. Judges might sit for a short session, handle many cases, and move on. They had limited staff. Written records could be brief. A confession reduced complexity. It also reduced the risk of contradiction between witnesses. If 2 eyewitnesses were required, the court needed 2 people whose statements matched. If witnesses changed their stories, the case weakened. A confession removed the need to align multiple accounts. This is one reason confession could outweigh facts, especially if the facts came in messy, conflicting forms. So what changed over time? Several slow changes reduced the centrality of confession. First, legal thinking about evidence evolved. Many systems began to accept that circumstantial evidence could be strong enough to convict. Courts started to value patterns of proof rather than only a few ranked categories. Second, the use of torture declined and was later abolished in many places. When torture was removed, courts had to face a hard truth: if conviction depends on confession, but confession cannot be forced, many cases will fail. So they developed other ways of proving guilt. Third, policing and investigation became more professional. As states built bureaucracies, they created trained officers, standardized procedures, and improved record keeping. They developed methods for identifying strangers, tracking repeat offenders, and sharing information across regions. Fourth, forensic science slowly grew. Autopsies, medical testimony, chemical analysis, photography, fingerprinting, and later DNA testing changed the meaning of facts. Facts became something that could be documented and tested, not just asserted by a witness. And finally, ideas about rights and fairness changed. Many modern legal systems treat confession with caution because of the risk of coercion. They require warnings, counsel, and rules about how questioning is conducted. These rules are part of a broader shift. Guilt is meant to be proven through evidence tested in court, not mainly through the accused person's own statement. Still, the older world explains something important about the history of justice. Confession-centered systems were not simply careless, they were built around older theories of proof and older practical limits. They aimed for certainty, but they defined certainty differently. To summarize the core reasons, confessions mattered more than investigation in many pre-modern systems. First, law often ranked proofs, and confession counted as complete proof. Second, serious crimes were hard to witness directly, so confession solved the problem of missing eyewitnesses. Third, investigative tools were limited, making indirect facts harder to verify. Fourth, religious and moral culture treated spoken admission as a sign of truth and accountability. Fifth, Authorities needed social closure and public order, and confession provided a simple conclusion. Sixth, confession could produce names of accomplices, expanding the reach of prosecutions. And finally, institutional limits, time, resources, and record keeping make confession a practical shortcut. Understanding this older logic helps explain many features of historical justice: the heavy use of interrogation, the reliance on community reputation, the growth of inquisitorial procedures, and the tragic role of coercion in some famous waves of prosecution. It also explains why modern criminal justice, even with all its technology, still pays close attention to confessions, while also treating them as evidence that must be handled carefully. In the long arc of legal history, the shift away from confession as the center of proof is not just a change in courtroom rules. It reflects a broader change in what societies count as knowledge, how they measure truth, and how much power the state is allowed to use to obtain it.